Welcome to Self-Publishing with ALLi from the Alliance of Independent Authors. This week it's our production and distribution stream focusing on guiding indie authors through the many pathways to create, publish, and distribute their work. We'll explore strategies, weigh the pros and cons of different models, and help you find the best fit for your publishing journey. This Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast is sponsored by BookVault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalties selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with BookVault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. This podcast is also sponsored by Gatekeeper Press, the all-inclusive gold standard in publishing, offering authors 100% rights, royalties, satisfaction, and worldwide distribution. Gatekeeper Press, where authors are family. And here's your host for the Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast, Anna Featherstone.
Welcome, writers, and hello to you wherever you are on this one-of-a-kind, wonderful planet we call home. I'm Anna Featherstone, author mentor and ALLi's non-fiction advisor, and I'm tuning in from the east coast of Australia on the unceded lands of the remarkable original storytellers of this place, the Biripi people. Today, we're going to be having a conversation about making your books more accessible to more types of readers. I've been doing some writing for a wonderful organization called Bus Stop Films, who are all about accessible filmmaking. And I thought, wait a minute, how does this apply to our books? And though I've kind of dabbled around the edges, today we're going to find out a whole lot more about what that all means. So Books Without Barriers, a practical guide to inclusive publishing, was a joint project between the Institute of Professional Editors and the Australian Publishers Association. And today we're joined by two of the co-authors, Julie Ganner and Agata Mrva-Montoya. So Julie is a freelance editor and lecturer in editing for the University of Sydney's Master of Publishing. And Dr. Agata is a senior lecturer and degree director of the Master of Publishing in the discipline of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney too. Thanks for joining us, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Oh, it's so great to have you. So I'm super excited to explore this subject because, firstly, it's about providing an equitable reading experience to all readers, no matter how they access our content. But also for all the authors listening, there are large audiences out there who you're potentially not reaching or serving well. For example, in Australia alone, around 1 in 5 people identify as having some form of disability, and many of them have conditions that make it difficult or impossible to read a printed book, a typical printed book. So various countries all around the world also have procurement standards for books. And if yours isn't accessible, it means organizations such as some educational institutions won't be able to purchase it. So let's get into it. What first got you both interested in making books accessible to all?
So maybe I get started. I used to work for Sydney University Press, and when we started producing ebooks, I really wanted to make them in-house, and this was before InDesign had an option of export EPUB file. So I did a lot of research, and I worked out that to do ebooks well, you need to add alternative text description. So this is what we were doing. But really without understanding the broader context of accessibility. But then I got invited to join the Australian Inclusive Publishing Initiative, where I learned more, but also realized that our books were not far off. And then in 2019, and Julie will probably talk more about it, AP, the Australian Publishing Inclusive Initiative, produced 2 guidelines, and I helped with accessible EPUB files. And this process of actually trying to work out how to do a good accessible EPUB helped me to fix the workflow processes at Sydney Uni Press. So I worked with the with Next Sense now currently. I think they used to be called slightly differently before. It's the Royal Institute for Deaf and Blind Children at the time. I worked with our technology provider. And by the end of the process, we had a perfectly accessible EPUB file. And this is how I got started. And then I moved to academia, and I made accessibility my research focus. So I'm particularly interested in how different countries have been implementing accessibility, in particularly Canada and, of course, European Union, where the European Accessibility Act is making a huge difference into how publishers produce books, and it's having impact in other countries around the world, including Australia. So the fact that publishers who publish with world rights, we need to produce books with accessibility embedded for the European market. But also since in the last few years, InDesign, the key industry software, has changed dramatically in preparation for the implementation of the European Accessibility Act. So it has worldwide implications. But I'll hand over to Julie now.
So you're quite at the cutting edge. So we're really lucky to have you today.
Thank you.
So thank you. And Julie, how about you?
Well, I really didn't know anything about accessibility. After Australia ratified the Marrakesh Treaty, which I won't go into in too much detail, but that was to facilitate the transfer of copyright across borders for people producing alternative formats. The Australian Publishers Association set up this Australian Inclusive Publishing Initiative, which was a forum that brought together alternative format providers, publishers, government departments, and so on, as well as people in the disability sector. And in 2017, the editors were invited to join it. And I happened to be the branch president of the New South Wales branch at that time. So the Institute of Professional Editors asked me to go along and represent IPED, the Institute, at this forum. And to be perfectly honest, I thought I was going along to meet some nice people, have a few sandwiches, listen to some interesting talks. And I was actually really horrified at my lack of knowledge when I got there. Just to hearing people talking about their experiences, not being able to access books if they had a vision impairment, the hoops that disability organizations were going through to create accessible books. And, you know, as I said, I felt really bad about it, that I had never really given sufficient thought to how someone with a print disability, such as vision impairment, actually accesses books. And more to the point as well, when I was listening to it, I thought, at least from an editorial and a writing point of view, how easily fixable a lot of the issues were. It's just that we don't know about them. So that's when I got involved, and I decided, right, we really need to do something about that. So the first thing that came out of the forum for me was my work on the first guide, which is Inclusive Publishing in Australia, and that we published that in 2019. That was just a small guide that's setting out the ethical, legal, and business case for accessible publishing. And that's available for free download, by the way, from the Australian Inclusive Publishing Initiative website and also the IPED website.
Wonderful. And so then how did the Books Without Barriers project come about?
Well, coming from that, we'd included just a few examples of accessibility best practice in the Inclusive Publishing Guide, which it wasn't really the focus. We were trying to kind of convince people of the need to create accessible books. But we were finding that users were really kind of zooming in on the few examples, the details we put in there, and saying, you know, this is what we need. This is the kind of level of detail we need, because we're convinced of the need to create accessible books, but we don't really know how. And we realized as well at the Institute of Professional Editors how scattered the resources were and how long it can take to find all the information you need. So we wanted a kind of a one-stop guide for editors that would, give you everything you needed to know in one publication. So IPED created a working party that was to create this guide for editors. And then once we got into it, we realized that actually that wasn't going to be sufficient, because editors don't work in a vacuum. We're part of a continuous workflow. So the decisions that are made somewhere else in the publishing process affect us too. So then we thought, okay, we've actually got to do a guide for everyone. So that's what we did. We created a guide that would cover the whole publishing workflow, from planning and contracts all the way through to production and testing.
Yeah, and it really is brilliant, and it's free, and there's a link at the end of the podcast to it. It's a remarkably useful guide. So thanks for everything you did on that. So tell us a little bit, for people who don't understand, all the different types of print disability there are.
Okay, well, first of all, I should emphasize that we're using the term print disability not as a physical or medical condition in itself. It's
Hmm.
actually a social situation. So it
Yep.
occurs when people with certain health conditions experience barriers to reading because information and stories are published in a form they can't perceive or understand. So what's happening is the way that content is written or the format in which it's published is literally, in some cases, disabling or excluding some people from reading part or all of the content. So that's one thing. The other thing is there's a common misunderstanding that print disability refers just to people with vision impairment, but it's much, much wider than that. So it can be a physical condition, for example. Something that might make it difficult or impossible to hold a book or turn the pages of a book. So that can be things like
Absolutely.
uh,
Arthritis.
yeah,
Yeah.
arthritis, cerebral palsy. It can be something that can make it difficult to focus the eyes or move them. So some people with multiple sclerosis experience that. And then we've got perceptual difficulties or learning difficulties as well, can also affect someone's ability to read a traditional printed book. So that might be somebody with dyslexia, for example, or autism. And then of course, you've
Yeah.
got all the visual conditions as well. So that's not just blindness, but people with low vision, people with medical conditions such as macular degeneration, and also things like color blindness too.
Yeah, and so there's a huge number of people affected by these conditions, some temporarily and some long term. So, what are some of the assistive technologies being used? And when authors think about how people are going to access their books, what do they need to know about things like screen readers and things like that?
So there's assistive technologies encompass a wide range of tools that help people with disabilities to access digital content more independently. The two types, the key categories are screen readers that access everything on a screen, and text-to-speech software that is used mainly for reading documents. And examples of screen readers include JAWS, NVDA, and VoiceOver. So actually, lots of laptops, desktops, and mobile devices offer built-in assistive technology for reading. So it's really good because the mainstream technology is now accessible. And text-to-speech is, for example, included in Microsoft Word. So everybody can just go to the right button and press read aloud and have the manuscript read to be read back to them, which is really great. Now, what happens is that screen readers navigate the document through heading, lists, and other structural elements. And that's why it's so important to start with, to implement formatting, proper structural formatting. So instead of using visual formatting, for example, making text bold and large, authors should use proper heading structure, heading tags, so that screen reader users can quickly jump from between sections and understand the document organization. It is also important for the reading order. So, for example, screen readers follow the underlying code structure, not the visual layout. So if the document is not prepared correctly, it might be read in a confusing sentence. And this is particularly notorious with PDF documents, especially if there are tables and columns and complex layouts. Unless you spend a lot of time on a PDF, it's not good.
Yeah.
The other thing that is really important is the inclusion of alternative text. So obviously, if someone cannot see, all the images, charts, and graphics are not visible to screen technology unless the alternative text description is provided. So these are the key elements that people should think about when producing content.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of authors listening to this podcast might also lay out their own books.
Yeah,
So, and I've found that in the early days too, like I would not set up my Word document properly. That then, if I put it into a program like Vellum,
that's
it couldn't
right.
work out what I was trying to do. Whereas if I just set up my styles first, so rather than bolding, I'd set my headers,
Exactly.
it would have worked better. But using Books Without Barriers as our reference, like I didn't realize things like, to minimize the use of italics is really good because it can be really hard to read for people, and that you need to bullet lists in certain ways. And like it's much more than just making your book accessible in different formats. So like print format, large print, ebook, and audio. They all help make your book accessible. But when we talk about creating books that are born accessible, Julie, what do you see with like those kind of editorial issues that can be fixed in the manuscript?
Yeah. So yes, a born accessible book is basically a digital publication that's designed from inception to be accessible. So in the past, there was a lot of retrofitting that happened. So a book was created as a print document and then kind of fixed up later, which is very laborious. It's not cost effective. And it meant that people with disabilities were actually having to wait a really long time to get an accessible version of it as well. So what we're trying to do now is make sure that the files that are created, the master files for the publication, are accessible right from the start. Accessibility has been factored into every part of the publishing workflow, and it's been planned right from the beginning. So those features are built in. So for writers and editors, this is basically making sure that things like language and illustrations are, first of all, they're perceivable. So that a reader will know that something is there. And secondly, that it's understandable. So it makes sense, even if you can't see it. And that means using, as I said, things like alt text, which will tell you that there's an image there and what's in it. And then making sure the language we use is actually accessible to people who don't have vision. So there's a couple of good examples. Italics and quote marks are very good examples of the kind of editorial things we can think about. Italics are really hard for some people to read. I must admit, as I'm getting older, I don't find big chunks of italics particularly easy to read myself. And they're particularly hard for people with low vision. So it's also adding an extra information load for people in Braille, because every time you have something like italics, you've got to have information cells in Braille that say start italics and end italics and so on. And the main thing is that an awful lot of italics that we use is actually unnecessary. So if you think about block quotes, for example, if it's already indented as a block quote and it's styled such so that someone listening to it knows that that's the style, why would we need to put it in italics as well? It's just making it hard to read. And the same with having bold plus italics in headings. The bold is quite sufficient in the styling. So there are other ways around it. I know fiction authors get a little nervous about this because italics is the internal monologue. So it's just worth having a chat with the designer that you're using and thinking about how else you can designate it. Because in the end, you may have written this wonderful piece of interior monologue, but if people can't read it, then you're really not doing yourself any favors either. So this is something that we can always think about. And a second one is a big problem here in Australia, particularly, is the use of single quote marks. So that's not usually an issue in the US, obviously, because the default style is double quote marks. But in Australia, it's the default, and it's used quite often in other countries too, such as the UK. And there's a big problem with this, is that, first of all, on our computer keyboards, an apostrophe and a single quote mark is the same key. But it's definitely not the same code in Braille. So somebody's going to be basically listening to the wrong instruction. And if you're using even a screen reader, some screen reader settings can read aloud whenever there's an apostrophe. So if you imagine a whole load of dialogue that's saying, apostrophe, apostrophe, every time something opens and closes.
Oh, wow.
Instead of a single quote, that's really problematic.
So how do you get around that? So you use a quote mark, or
just use a double quote mark instead of single quote mark? Yeah, so that's what we're recommending for anyone who's usually using single quote marks as a default style. It's just switch to double quote marks. It's also a massive problem for Braille transcribers because they've got to go through them all. Apparently, when text is scanned to put it into Braille, then quite often single quote marks, particularly when they're combined with serif fonts, create all kinds of weird things. The software can't read it properly. So they get P's and T's and all kinds of weird things that are instead of the quote mark. So again, just using only using the double quote marks instead makes a really big difference for everyone. And that's what we recommend in Books Without Barriers.
Okay, yeah, I'm like learning so much right now. But I'm going to have to strip away my bolds, my italics. So it might take me, like I'll just have to get used to it, but I think it's worth it. And I got it. What about formatting issues?
Yeah, so double quote marks are also easy to read for people with poor vision. They are just more visible on the page. So we mentioned before about the styling, how important it is to proper structure. And as you said, it's not just about accessibility. It actually makes the formatting it makes your writing easier because you can easily create table of contents. And you can easily change the style, and it works with software, with layout software much easier because it's already styled. So it's so much better to do it as a writer from starting. But also it's much easier than to produce in other formats like large print as well, and not only just ebooks. But we also need to think about design in terms of typography, the color and contrast in images and so on. Make sure that the font sizes are legible, make sure the line spacing is appropriate and so on. And also think about the images, what type of images are chosen. Are they going to be, do they contribute to the content? Are they going to be easy to describe, even if you can't see them? Charts and graphs, this is a huge issue, especially if you think about color blindness, to make sure that color is not the only way the information is conveyed. So basically, Born Accessible is not just digital. I mean, it is predominantly digital, but we also need to think about print to make sure that the print version of the book is as accessible as possible to people who might have poor vision. So this is where all the different elements need to be taken into account.
I even notice, just when I'm reading a book myself, I'm like, oh, that line spacing is making it difficult to read. So I can only imagine for someone with, worse vision than me, like how much harder that is.
Yeah.
And that's for a lot of indie authors when you're thinking about laying out your books, like getting that appropriate line spacing so it's a little bit generous.
That's right.
Is a great idea.
That's right. So it's book accessible is for people beyond 2020. So it's not just for those who've got perfect vision, but it allows for comfortable reading experience to a slightly wider group than just those with perfect vision.
Yeah. And also, I know people have to weigh up that too. Like, if you add in more space, it might mean more pages, which might mean the book becomes heavier. Unless, so that might be harder for someone to hold up with a different issue. So, but there's ways around that too, like with your margins and the GSM of your paper, those kind of things. So I'm interested for children's book authors, Julie. What are some examples of how you can make children's books more accessible?
Well, one of the main things you need to think about, particularly for children, is really be very careful about your language and avoid using purely visual language. Students who have a vision impairment do learn about things like color when they're older. But for young children, it's a completely abstract, meaningless concept if they can't see color. So we really need to think about those things. I'll give you an example. If you have an alphabet book, for example, if you had G is for green, there's nothing that a disability organization, a class can do with that to help a child understand what that means, which means they can't use that part of the book. It doesn't make sense. But if you had, rather than having this very abstract concept, if you used a concrete concept instead, such as G is for grass, that's something that everybody, irrespective of what senses they use, can still access. Grass is something you can sit on, you can touch, you might be able to walk on, you can feel it, you can smell it, you might even taste it if you want to put a bit in your mouth. So that's a really concrete example for children. And when we're getting into things like read aloud stories, we can use things like repeated words, rhyme, and other forms of engaging language. These are going to make the story much more interesting for all children, whether or not they can see the illustrations. So again, accessibility best practice is actually best practice for everyone. Does tend to improve the book for everyone. And other things you have to think about is also that so a child that wants to is reading a book that you've created in class, the teachers are very often going to create tactile versions of the characters or something in the book so the child can actually participate because they can't see the pictures. So if you add an element in there that can actually perceive tactually as well as visually, it's really going to help engage the children. So, for example, if you had a book with some rabbits in it and they were different colored rabbits, a red rabbit versus a blue rabbit is not going to make any difference. That's not perceivable to a child. It's not understandable. But if you had a red spotty rabbit and a blue stripy rabbit, then the teacher can create a tactile version of that. So the child can actually feel an image of what each rabbit looks like. And it helps them create a mental construct of the story that differentiates between these characters.
And it's more fun too.
That is absolutely. So
More fun for everyone.
yeah, that's right. And so that's what we're saying is kind of use descriptive, multi-sensory language wherever possible. It's not that we're stripping out the visual details, we're just adding more to it. And that includes not just referring the child to the visual illustration as well. Next Sense, which is a disability organization that teaches deaf or students with hearing loss and vision impairment, gave us a lovely example. They said rather than having a phrase like "look at the jellyfish," which is completely unhelpful for children with vision impairment, they suggested jellyfish are like little squishy upside down jelly bags that have strings coming out at the bottom. Isn't that gorgeous?
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yes, yes. And as writers, why aren't we being more descriptive like that?
Yeah.
It's almost like we've become a bit lazy in just using the most simple thing. Like writers, like we do create. So being able to create these magnificent descriptions is like actually really exciting.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And it's something that, writers are very well equipped to do. It's just we've just got to think about it.
Yeah. Okay, so what about when it comes to illustrations? How do we make them more accessible?
Yeah, so this is where it's important to think how a disability organization such as Next Sense might convert this particular book to accessible format. So with illustrations, what it means is provide like a printing on top, raising just raised edges to the image. And this is where it's important to avoid something called occlusion in images, which refers to when one object partially or completely blocks the view of another object behind it. So, for example, if you think of an image of an animal, it's good to show all four legs in profile. So, if there is an edge to the image that child without seeing can trace, and it sort of makes sense just by touch.
So like rather than the animal turning back on itself or crouching in a way that part of its body is hidden.
That's right. Okay. Exactly. Yeah. So this is important for in books for very young children who have not yet learned about this concept. So it just it'll make it much easier for alternative format producers to produce tactile versions of images. And again, then obviously color contrast and things like this. So this is for kids who might have poor vision, making sure that we think about it when producing illustrations.
It seems to me like all these things that we can do for accessibility really just do make richer content, like makes it just so much more valuable and enjoyable for everyone.
Yeah.
So, okay. Now, a lot of our indie authors who are listening also do marketing. So when we talk about using effective image descriptions in books, so that people, understand what illustration there is in maybe your ebook or whatever. So we have to write them for those, but also in social media, being able to write effective image descriptions. So what are some tips there?
Well, the tips for writing image descriptions in books and writing them in social media are pretty much the same because it's the same principle. The first thing is to remember that a reader who's blind is building or someone who actually is listening, who might be listening to an audio book, by the way, who may have vision but can't see your illustration. They're building a mental construct of the image, and if they're blind, they're basing that construct on things like the spatial relationship between things and what it might feel like in a 3D version rather than a visual construct. So we've got to think about how much information we're going to include, because people who can see tend to find illustrations helpful, helps them understand the content. But somebody who can't see, if you pile on too much information, it makes it too hard to build up that image. So we do have to get a fine balance between giving enough information to avoid a gap in understanding and giving too much detail, which creates mental clutter that's going to impede understanding. So one of the first things we think about is just think about the context and the purpose of the image. And as I said, it goes across whether it's for social media, whether it's for marketing, whether it's for the book itself. First of all, think about who's the image for? What's the reading level? If it's for children, obviously you really need to take that into account in your description, just as you would in the text you're writing. And also, what is the image for? What's the information that it's trying to convey? And that will help you decide what to emphasize and what to leave out. And then there's just some basic principles we can always think about. First of all, making sure we describe any image unless it's purely decorative. And that's pretty much borders and a few other very minor details, but everything else we really do need to make sure we have some description for. Otherwise, somebody using a screen reader is just going to hear null, void, something like that. And anyone with using the Braille version, the poor Braille transcriber is going to have to write it. The second thing is making sure that our descriptions are as succinct as possible so that we're not giving people information overload. So just leave out anything that's unimportant and that's not going to help the reader understand what the image is meant to convey. Another one is to be objective. So we don't make judgments or assumptions or try to interpret the image. We're literally just describing what we can see. And then put the key information first, because someone then can listen to that, and then if they don't want any more detail, they can skip on, just like you can quickly glance at an image and decide whether you want to give it a closer look or not. So give an overview of the image first, what's in it, and then provide further details.
That's a great tip.
Yeah, so that's if you need them. You might not. And the second thing is to make sure you provide information and concepts in small chunks rather than big, long, an image description that goes on for several lines, but it's all one sentence, because that's really hard. Again, you've got to build up this mental image. So I always look at things like and, but, or, all those words in my image description. And if I see those, that's when I try and put a full stop in there somewhere to break it up. So keep it nice and succinct. It's an easy way to do it. Sometimes I just write it in long form first, however it comes out, and then I edit it to see how I can break it up, putting that key information first, and then the rest of it, the information afterwards, in small chunks. And another thing is just making sure that we provide each bit of information only once. So sometimes I see alt text that's basically just repeating the caption, or it's repeating what's in the text. And again, that's just unnecessary clutter. It's a little bit lazy, to be honest, because it's not providing any more information. It's just filling a gap. So we do want this information to be useful. So we think about what's in the text, add a bit more information in the caption if there is one. And then if you still need more information, you can put it in the alt text. It might be something that's only very brief. So yeah, you're just deciding how much to put in there, but we don't repeat ourselves. And I think one final tip would probably just remembering to include any text that's part of the image as well, unless there's lots and lots of it. Like you can see all the spines on the bookshelf behind me, we wouldn't want all of those. But if there's something that's important in the text, remember to describe that too, because somebody can't read it. So if it's, an illustration with a sign in it, for example, make sure that you remember to transcribe the sign exactly as it appears.
That's interesting, because I was under the impression that but I was obviously thinking if they were using a screen reader, they wouldn't need to read the text again in the image description. But obviously, if they're not using a screen reader, or yeah,
Well, if it's
that's
an
interesting.
image, it's an illustration, then the screen reader can't read that. So
Yeah,
if it's
yeah.
next to it, if it's part of the actual reading text, that's fine. But if you've got, I think in Books Without Barriers, we've got a children's book with and swimming in some animals swimming in a creek, and you've got to describe the signs that are next to the creek because that's part of the image.
Mm.
The screen reader can't access that.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Really good information. Thank you. Oh my goodness, I'm learning a lot. So now I want to learn about semantic tagging. So I'd never heard of that word before. So Agata, can you tell us why it's important, and why we should be making more use of, like, if we're writing in Word or Google or Scrivener or whatever we're doing, to make use of their style features for headings and things like that?
So but you're using it. You just said you're using it, which is great. So semantic tagging is the practice of marking up content based on its meaning and function rather than just its appearance. So in Microsoft Word, it means using the built-in style features, which is like you, Anna said, using heading 1, heading 2, special style for quotes, etc., instead of manually formatting text with bold font size changes or other visual formatting. So we talked a little bit about this already, how important it is for accessing content via using screen readers, because then screen readers can navigate through document structure so that visually impaired readers can jump between sections, while manual bold formatting provides no information for assistive technology at all. The styles also allow writers to ensure uniform appearance of the manuscript, which is so important, and they can very easily change the way your manuscript looks in a second, because you just change the style and it all nicely reflows. So if you want to proofread your text with a fresh pair of eyes, you just change your typeface. So it allows you to navigate. So when you're writing in one long document, it's very easy then for you to navigate between different chapters and sections, which is great, rather than try to search. You can create automated table of contents, which is brilliant, rather than manually do it. So this is another very important function. Now, what you, Anna, mentioned yourself is that you really need to have text formatted correctly in order to then use it with some of the publishing software. So it works with InDesign and it saves you time. It works with other platforms that you basically require you to upload a formatted document. Your publisher, your designers will love you, because it means that they have less work, because then they just worry about how to format those styles in the different types, but they don't have to code it. So it's much, much easier. And it's absolutely essential for export to EPUB file.
Yeah,
You
wonderful.
just can't work without
Yeah,
it.
it literally makes everyone's lives easier.
Yeah.
The authors, the editors, everyone, and then eventually the reader. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I wish I'd known that years ago, because
Well, this is really interesting because it doesn't sound like we are taught. So I teach students, and so
yeah.
in my class, this is the first thing you do in the first class, and it's like revelation. And I'm thinking, like, all those essays you've been writing, where are you?
Exactly. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay, so also then, what about, like, using, like, contrast? Like, when people see things, some people, even just when you're scrolling on social media, you see some things look so difficult to look at because the font and the background don't work together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is where and there are checkers on website. It's mainly from web accessibility perspective. You need to make sure that there's enough contrast between your typography and your backgrounds, so that it's easy to read. And it works for both books and digital. And there are different checkers on the website. Just look for color contrast and you can check it yourself.
Yeah.
So for example, having white font on black background, it's really difficult. And it's best to be avoided unless, for some, I don't know, title pages that are completely black, but it's just really hard to read. That said, some people might like to read digital books in this fashion. So, but they chose, but
they can kind of choose that, can't
that's
they?
right.
Yes,
that's the beauty of
because
preferable EPUB, that you can choose how you want to read it.
Yeah,
But
on the
most
readers.
people, having small white serif fonts on black background is a disaster.
Yeah. What about so a lot of fiction authors especially love those really swooshy decorative fonts for their
Yeah,
headers. What
yeah.
do you think about that?
Use with caution. So definitely, there's space for decorative typography, but they should only be used in headers. So your book title, maybe chapter titles, and sparingly. They need to be bigger, and you just need to look at them and see whether they are legible. Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that your readers can actually read it. So make sure, just look critically whether you can actually get someone else to read it, get someone else, your friend, to say, can you actually read it without making an effort? Test it on a small screen. Can people still read it on the phone? Can they read it in poor lighting? Can they read it if they are tired? And it's definitely a good practice to avoid having caps in italics together. Not a good look and very, very hard to read. And it's just, we just need to keep in mind that, for example, in Australia, over 50% of population have one or more chronic long-term eye conditions, according to Australian Bureau of Statistics 2017-2018 National Health Survey. So, Luna, there are 3 of us, and 2 of us are wearing glasses.
Yeah.
We don't have print disability, but it's an effort to read something that we, that it's not well designed. So I think we can use decorative fonts, but we need to look critically.
And there are some that are much easier to read.
Absolutely.
So, we have hundreds and hundreds of fonts available to us to choose from. So what are some of the more accessible fonts we can do the bulk of our work in?
So there's this ongoing debate about sans serif versus serif. And this is actually not that...
sans serif
and serif fonts.
And serif fonts.
Yeah. So this is not really that... yes, it's not that basically both can be legible and not legible. So in terms of the different typefaces, they exist on a continuum for less accessible to more accessible. And what really matters is the X height. So X height refers to the height of lowercase letters without ascenders. So like B and D had ascenders, and G and P have descenders. And basically it's the height of the lowercase x. So the fonts that have larger X heights are generally more accessible because the main body of each letter is bigger relative to the overall font size. Right. So this really matters because our reading relies on recognizing the shape of lowercase letters. So when the X height is generous, in which case, letters like A, E, O, and N are relatively tall, then it's easier they become more distinct and it's easier to process. So when we are looking for more accessible typeface, we need to look at, whether we prefer serif or sans serif. We need to look at the X height, and the bigger ones are the ones more accessible. And there are some, like Verdana is pretty accessible, ALLi is pretty accessible. There are some specific ones. There is Atkinson's Hyper Legible that was designed specially for print disability, but we've got quite a bit of flexibility. It's just we have to avoid those tiny ones. Now there is also specific, Georgia is good, Sabon is good. There are specific typefaces designed for readers with dyslexia, like dyslexia, Jill dyslexic, open dyslexic, but they are actually the studies on their use have been quite conflicting. So some studies show that there is a modest improvement in reading speed and accuracy for people with dyslexia, but other studies find no significant benefits. And in fact, some studies show that using Arial on Times New Roman is better. So it's not necessary. So basically, it's better to go for accessible font that have generous character spacing, distinct letter shapes, for example, I and L, larger X height, and not overly decorative, and use this instead of sort of going into specific fonts. So yeah.
Some of the fonts you mentioned then, so like Georgia, Sabon, Calibri, Verdana, and Tahoma, I actually recognize them. But I've never heard of Atkinson Hyperlegible.
That's
before.
a new one. That was a font designed specifically for readers with poor vision, I think 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. Oh,
Free
that's
online,
fascinating.
free online to download. So
Yeah, wonderful. Like, there's no reason not to be using them then. So, okay, so when we come to ebook accessibility, can you talk us quickly through the difference between like the digital formats of reflowable and fixed layout EPUB files, and how, which is the best? Or
yeah, absolutely. So first thing I need to say that PDF, some people think of it as a digital book, but it's not accessible. You need to do a lot of work for PDF to be accessible, and it's really complicated, especially when producing PDF from InDesign. So EPUB format is much better, and there are two main types of EPUB files. Reflowable EPUB are those files that are designed to adapt to different screen sizes and user preferences. So these are the books that we can easily download and read on our phones, read on our iPads, read on Kindle, and readers can adjust font size, can adjust type, can adjust line spacing, margins, and background color. And this is really, really great because it provides readers with a lot of flexibility. Now, fixed layout EPUB really looks like a PDF. So basically everything stays, all the text, images, and design elements stay in precisely the same location, which means that, for example, they are not legible on phones because you have a very small image. Why it's used? Because if layout matters, for example, in children's picture books or graphic novels or cookbooks, this is where publishers decide to go with fixed layout EPUB. But it's not as accessible as reflowable because they provide much more flexibility for readers to adjust. Readers can adjust the font to 24 points if they like.
Yeah.
Change, all the stuff that I said before. Also, they work much better with screen readers because they're reading order naturally, it just follows natural reading order, while the fixed layout, they need to have more work done in order for the screen readers to follow the reading order. So, if someone works on a highly designed publication, they might choose fixed layout EPUB, but if it's just pure text with not many images, reflowable EPUB is much better.
Yeah. And also, like, obviously a lot of people are using e-readers too because they're lighter to hold and to transport as well.
Yes.
So and also audiobooks take away some of the visual problems because we can listen. So there's a lot happening in the space, isn't there?
That's right.
But as writers and as especially indie authors, it's up to us to really work out the best way to make our books more accessible, whether it's larger formats or all these great ideas you've been sharing with us. So, Julie, is there anything extra you'd like to share with indie authors about this whole subject?
There's just a couple of things. First of all, a reminder, I think we've made this clear all the way through, that inclusive and accessible publishing is really just good publishing. So you're not doing anything extraordinary there. We're trying to improve the reading experience for everyone, not just readers with print disability. And an easy way to think about it, if you're wondering whether your content is accessible, is just think, if it's text, is it still going to make sense to you if you were listening to it as an audiobook, for example? Or if you're an illustrator, would you be able to create something that is still going to be perceivable if it was created in a tactile version? These are really quite simple things if you're touching a 3D version of it. And secondly, just don't panic. I think you kind of worry sometimes like, oh my goodness, I've got to do all these things and it's going to be really hard. So I always like to remind people that, we're working in a really creative industry. So we're used to thinking of solutions in how to ensure clear communication. That's what we do as part of our work. So I'd like to finish with a lovely story that I was told about a teacher who had to teach blind children about the difference between clarity and opacity. And so what he did is he got a bit of cling film, put it on his face, and asked the children to touch it and said, "That is clarity." And then he got a bit of cardboard and put it in front of his face and said, "That's opacity." That's a beautiful, clear, creative solution to avoiding accessibility problems and communicating ideas. And I just like to remind authors that you all have that skill set. So making your content accessible is just an extension of what you already do. So don't worry about it. You're already there. You've got the tools already.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And, we can be even more creative. I love that. You're giving us all permission to do what we do best and just putting in that extra info for us to do so. So where can people get this fantastic guide?
Well, as you mentioned, Anna, it's free to download, and we've created it in various choices of formats as well, because choice is important for accessibility. We all like to read in different ways. So you can find it on the IPED website. It's www.iped-editors.org.au, and then it's under the About Editors resources tab. And you can also find it on the website of the Australian Publishers Association and the Australian Society of Authors.
Brilliant. And we'll be adding a link too at the bottom of the show notes as well. So thank you so much, both of you, for sharing that info with us and with writers all around the world. Really appreciate your time, Julie and Agata.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.
And thank you to all you listeners out there as well for tuning in. Until next time, I'm Anna Featherston for ALLi, and here's to you and all you're creating, and may you do it more accessibly going forward. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the production and distribution stream of the Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast with Anna Featherstone. This Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast is sponsored by Book Vault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalties selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with Book Vault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. This podcast is also sponsored by Gatekeeper Press, the all-inclusive gold standard in publishing, offering authors 100% rights, royalties, satisfaction, and worldwide distribution. Gatekeeper Press, where authors are family. And if you haven't already, we invite you to join our organization and become a self-publishing ally. You can do that at allianceindependentauthors.org.